Hello and welcome to the Sleepy Christian. Tonight, we're going to talk about the greatest moments in the Bible. From the very beginning to the quiet miracles, we'll journey through stories that shaped everything softly, peacefully, just right for sleep. So, take a deep breath, rest your eyes, and let your heart settle as we begin. Before there was anything, before skies or oceans, before the earth had shape or sound, before time itself, there was God. No noise, no motion, just a vast, quiet nothing. And into that stillness, into the calm of eternity, came a single word: let there be light. And suddenly, light spilled into the darkness, stretching out like golden threads through a black canvas. That was the beginning, the first moment. Not a bang, not a crash, but a word, gentle and full of power. Light separated from darkness, and day was born. God looked at it and saw that it was good. Then came the sky, stretched like a dome over the earth. Waters were drawn back so dry land could rise. Mountains pushed up from the deep. Rivers wound like silver ribbons through the valleys. Trees took root and began to sway gently in the breeze, and every kind of flower opened its petals under the sunlight for the very first time. The earth came alive, green and gold, and full of promise. But the story didn't stop with land and water. God filled the sky with stars, scattering them across the heavens in patterns no one had yet seen. He gave us the sun to warm the day and the moon to light the night, both moving faithfully in a rhythm that would never break. The ocean stirred as fish began to swim, shimmering scales flickering beneath the surface. Birds took to the skies, each wingbeat a soft hymn of new life. Lions walked the plains. Deer leapt through meadows. Every creature, from the smallest insect to the tallest giraffe, was crafted with care. The world pulsed with movement and music, not a sound like we know, but the harmony of creation itself. Everything had a place. Everything belonged. And then, at the heart of it all, came the most delicate creation. From the dust of the earth, God formed a man, shaping him with his own hands. And when the form was finished, he leaned close and breathed life into him. That breath, the very breath of God, filled the man's lungs. His eyes opened. He saw sky and leaf, light and shadow. He was called Adam. Soon, God made a companion for him, not from the ground, but from Adam's own side, so they would always walk together. Her name was Eve. Together, they lived in a garden called Eden, a place of perfect peace. There was no fear, no pain, no separation. They walked with God in the cool of the day, without shame or worry. The grass was soft beneath their feet, and the fruit hung heavy on the trees, sweet and within reach. Every need was met, every step was safe. In that garden, work wasn't toil, it was joy, tending the land, naming the animals. It was part of their harmony with creation. There was rhythm and stillness, sound and silence, and all around them was the presence of the one who made it all. Can you imagine it? A world without brokenness, without noise, without rush, where time itself felt like a soft river, moving but never harsh. That was how it all began, not with war or hunger or fear, but with love spoken into being. The world was young, alive, and untouched. And as night settled over the first day, the stars blinked softly into view, as if heaven itself had opened its eyes for the very first time. And God looked at everything he had made: the sky, the sea, the land, the animals, the man and woman, and he said, "It is very good." Then he rested. Not because he was tired, but because the work was complete, perfect, whole. The first Sabbath, the first silence, a sacred stillness where everything simply was, held, loved, known. As you drift off tonight, you're not just remembering how the world was made, you're returning to it, in a way. Back to the garden, back to the beginning, where the stars sang, the rivers danced, and the Creator walked with his creation. Let your thoughts settle there. Let your heart rest where everything began. In the heart of the garden, there was one tree, unlike the others. It stood tall, its fruit radiant, beautiful, almost glowing. It was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God had given Adam and Eve every tree, every plant, every river, every joy. He walked with them, spoke with them, delighted in them. But this one tree, this one, he asked them not to touch, not to eat from it. You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, he had said, but not from this one, for if you do, you will surely die. It wasn't a threat, it was a boundary. A loving parent drawing a line in the sand for a child not yet ready to understand what danger meant. For in that boundary was trust, trust that his way was enough, that his love would satisfy, that his presence would protect. But one day, in the gentle hush of the garden, a whisper rose from the shadows. A serpent, subtle and clever, slid between the leaves. He didn't shout. He asked a question. Did God really say? Doubt, like a drop of ink in clear water, began to spread. Eve looked at the tree. The fruit was beautiful, tempting. The whisper promised wisdom. Promised that they wouldn't die, but would become like God, knowing good and evil. So she reached, she touched, she tasted, and she gave some to Adam, who stood silently nearby. He ate, too, and the world shifted. Suddenly, they saw themselves, really saw themselves. They felt something new, shame, fear, an ache that hadn't existed before. They covered themselves with leaves, small and fragile, not nearly enough to hide the ache inside. And when they heard the sound of God walking in the garden, the sound that once brought peace, now brought fear, they hid. But God called out not with anger, but with sorrow. Where are you? A question not for his sake, but for theirs. Where had they gone, not just their bodies, but their hearts? They confessed. They admitted what they had done. The serpent was cursed to crawl, the woman to bear pain, the man to labor, and the garden, once open and free, was closed. Not forever, but for now. God made them clothes, not from leaves, but from skins. Something had to die to cover them. A life, innocent, given to protect them in their brokenness. Even in justice, there was mercy. Even in exile, there was care. And then came the promise quiet, buried like a seed in sorrow. One day, God said, a child would come, a descendant of Eve, and he would crush the head of the serpent, even though he himself would be wounded. The first glimpse of a savior, not an idea, but a person, a rescuer. The promise of hope woven into the moment of greatest loss. Adam and Eve left the garden that day. They walked east, past the cherubim with the flaming sword that guarded the way back. The sky looked different, the air heavier, but God had not abandoned them. He still watched, he still spoke, he still loved. The story was no longer perfect, but it was not over. And even in the darkness, the promise glowed faintly like a distant star. You see, the fall wasn't just about a piece of fruit. It was about choice, about love that isn't forced, about a creator who gave his children freedom, even knowing the cost, and about a love so deep that he already had a plan to bring them back. The story of the fall isn't just a story of loss, it's a story of return. A quiet promise that even when we hide, even when we fail, even when we choose the wrong path, God still comes looking, still asking, where are you? Still offering hope, restoration, a way back home. That way would take time. It would wind through deserts and kingdoms, prophets and poems, until one day, a different garden would bloom. And in it, another choice would be made. But for now, the story continues, not ended, only paused with grace, already whispering through the trees. The world had changed. People multiplied across the earth, building cities, raising families, crafting tools, singing songs, but something else grew alongside them. Violence, pride, cruelty. What began as a small crack in the garden widened into a deep fracture. People began to forget God. They lived for themselves, chasing power, chasing their own name. They spoke with their mouths, but ignored him with their hearts. The earth, once full of harmony, became soaked in sorrow. And God, who had breathed life into mankind, now looked upon the world with grief. He saw that every thought of the human heart was only evil, all the time. It broke him. Creation had strayed far from its creator. But in the middle of all the darkness, there was one man. His name was Noah, not perfect, not without flaw, but faithful. He listened, he trusted, he walked with God when no one else did. While the world raged with chaos, Noah's life moved in quiet rhythm with his Creator. And so, God came to him with a strange instruction, something no one had ever seen before. "Build an ark," God said. "A vessel of wood, wide and long and sealed with pitch, big enough to hold not just Noah's family, but animal stew of every kind, male and female, birds of the sky, beasts of the field, creatures that crawled, and those that leapt." It sounded impossible. The skies were clear. There was no rain. People mocked him, laughed as they passed by. But Noah kept building. Every board, every nail, was an act of faith. Every blow of the hammer said, "I believe you, God, even when I don't understand." And then, one day, the animals came. Slowly, steadily, as if guided by an unseen hand. They walked up the ramp 2 by 2, lions beside lambs, eagles beside doves. And then Noah and his family entered the ark. 7 days passed. A hush fell over the earth. And then, the skies opened. Not a drizzle, not a gentle shower, but torrents. Water poured from the heavens and burst up from the deep. The very ground cracked open and released its hidden oceans. Rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights. The rivers rose, the hills vanished, and the ark began to float carried, not by human power, but by the hand of God. Imagine that, a single vessel adrift in a world of water, no land in sight, just grey skies, waves, and the steady creaking of wood. But inside, there was light, there was warmth. There was the heartbeat of life continuing, protected. Noah waited. He watched. He prayed. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. And then, one morning, the rain stopped. The clouds broke. Silence returned. But the earth was still covered in water. So Noah waited longer. He sent out a raven, then a dove. The dove returned with nothing. He waited again. Then the dove came back with a leaf in its beak, a small branch, still green, hope. Eventually, the waters receded, the ground reappeared, and the day came when God spoke again, "Come out of the ark." So Noah stepped out onto dry land. The air was different, fresh, clean, quiet. The world had been washed, not in wrath, but in mercy, a second beginning. The first thing Noah did wasn't build a house or plant a field. He built an altar, and he worshipped. His first act on this new earth was gratitude. And then God, who sees the heart, made a promise not just to Noah, but to all of creation. Never again would he flood the whole earth. Never again would he destroy all life. And as a sign, he stretched a rainbow across the sky, a bow of light, bending in color, as if heaven itself had reached down to embrace the earth. Every time the rain falls and the sky clears, that promise still glows, not forgotten, not faded, eternal. The story of Noah is not just about judgment or storms. It's about refuge. It's about a God who watches over the faithful, even when the world is drowning. It's about starting again. And even when all seems lost, when the sky darkens and the waters rise, there is always an ark, a place prepared, a hand guiding, a future waiting just beyond the flood. As you rest now, imagine that ark rocking gently on the waters, safe and steady, under stars that return one by one, a quiet place in a stormy world, just as God intended. Late one night, beneath a canopy of stars, too many to count, an old man stepped out of his tent and lifted his face to the sky. The desert air was cool and silent, the ground dry and still, but above him shimmered a vast ocean of light, stars scattered like grains of sand across a dark sea. This man's name was Abram, and though his years were many and his bones had grown tired, his heart still held space for something more, something unseen. That night, God spoke to him, not in thunder, not in fire, but in a voice so still it could settle between heartbeats, "Look up," the voice said. "Count the stars if you can, so shall your descendants be." It seemed impossible. Abram had no children. His wife, Sarai, was long past the years of bearing life. Their tent was quiet, their evenings still, no little footsteps, no cries in the night, no laughter from sons or daughters. They had wandered far from their homeland, following this invisible God who promised much, but gave little, or so it seemed. But when God said, "Look up," Abram looked. And when God said, "So shall your descendants be," Abram believed. That belief, quiet, deep, perhaps even trembling, was the beginning of something eternal. Not just a family, but a nation. Not just descendants, but a covenant. Years passed, more waiting, more wandering. There were moments of trust and moments of fear. At one point, Sarai, in her pain and doubt, offered her servant Hagar to Abram, hoping to fulfill the promise in her own way. A child was born, Ishmael. But God gently reminded them, "It is through you, Sarai, that the child of promise will come." She laughed when she heard it, not a joyful laugh, but one full of disbelief. She was 90 years old, her body tired, her womb silent for decades. But God repeated his promise, and in time, her laughter changed. When the child was finally born, she named him Isaac, laughter, because now she laughed not from doubt, but from joy. A joy that caught in the throat, that spilled from the eyes, that shook the heart awake. As Isaac grew, so did the covenant. God changed Abram's name to Abraham, father of many, and Sarai became Sarah, mother of nations. They were no longer just a couple with a child. They were the root of a tree that would stretch across generations. From their line would come Jacob, who would become Israel. From Israel, 12 sons. From the 12 tribes. And through them, an entire people chosen, called, carried, not because they were better, but because they were loved. But God asked something of Abraham, something that would test the very core of his faith. One morning, God told him to take Isaac, his only son, the child of promise, and offer him as a sacrifice. It was a command that made no sense. This was the boy God had given after years of waiting, the boy whose very life fulfilled the stars in the sky. But Abraham obeyed. With a heart heavy and hands trembling, he climbed the mountain. Isaac carried the wood, Abraham carried the fire and the knife. And just as he raised his hand, just as the test reached its peak, God called out, "Do not harm the boy. Now I know you trust me." And there, tangled in the thorns, was a ram, a substitute, a provision, a whisper of something deeper to come. That mountain moment echoed through the ages. It wasn't about cruelty. It wasn't about loss. It was about faith, about trust that goes beyond what we see, about knowing that even when the way looks terrifying, God provides, and that provision so gentle, so precious, the rhythm of the covenant. Isaac lived. Abraham passed the test, and the stars above still sparkled, bearing witness to a promise that had not failed. The story of Abraham isn't just about a man or a miracle child. It's about a journey, a long, winding road walked in the dark, lit only by belief. It's about a God who doesn't rush, who takes time, who allows us to wrestle and doubt and still come close. Abraham's faith wasn't perfect. He questioned, he stumbled, he made mistakes. But he kept walking, kept believing, and God stayed faithful, not because Abraham earned it, but because he is faithful by nature. As you lie here now, think of the stars above that desert, silent, steady, and stretching far beyond the eye. That same sky remains, the same stars shine, and the same God who whispered to an old man in the quiet of the night still speaks today, still promises, still waits for hearts willing to trust, even when the answers don't come quickly, especially then. Because sometimes, the greatest stories begin with just a step into the unknown and a look toward the stars. Joseph was just a boy when the dreams began. He was the son of Jacob, the firstborn of Rachel, and from the moment he opened his eyes to the world, he was set apart. His father loved him more than his brothers, deeply, openly, perhaps a bit too obviously. He gave him a coat woven with many colors, bright and rich, something none of the others had. And while the coat itself was only fabric, it quickly became a symbol, a daily reminder to his brothers that Joseph was different, favored, chosen. But it wasn't just the coat that stirred jealousy. It was the dreams. Joseph told his family what he saw at night. In one dream, their bundles of grain bowed down to his. In another, the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed before him. The message was clear. He would rise, and they would kneel. He was young, perhaps too young to understand the weight of his own words, and so his brothers' envy hardened into something darker. They waited, they watched, until one day, when Joseph went to check on them in the fields, they saw their chance. At first, they planned to kill him, but instead, they threw him into a dry well. They sat nearby, eating bread while their brother wept in the shadows of the pit. And when a caravan passed by, headed for Egypt, they sold him. Their own flesh and blood sold for silver. They stained his beautiful coat with goat's blood and returned home, telling their father that a wild animal had devoured him. But Joseph wasn't dead. Far from it. In Egypt, he was sold again, this time to a man named Potiphar, an official in Pharaoh's court. And even in that foreign land, God was with him. Joseph worked hard, and everything he touched prospered. Potiphar saw it and gave him charge over his household. But not everyone in the house had pure intentions. Potiphar's wife watched Joseph closely. Day after day, she tempted him. But Joseph, faithful even in silence, refused. He said no, not just to her, but to sin, to betrayal. And for that, she lied. She tore at his cloak, accused him of things he didn't do, and Joseph was thrown into prison. Once again, he was cast down into darkness. Once again, forgotten, but not by God. In the cold quiet of a prison cell, Joseph waited. And in that waiting, he listened. 2 prisoners came to him, on a cupbearer, the other a baker, both disturbed by dreams they couldn't understand. Joseph interpreted them. One would be restored to Pharaoh's court, the other would be executed. It happened exactly as he said, and before the cupbearer left, Joseph begged, "Remember me, tell Pharaoh about me." But the man forgot. Joseph remained in the shadows. 1 year passed. Then another. Still, he waited. And then, one night, Pharaoh himself had a dream. He saw 7 fat cows swallowed by 7 skinny ones, 7 full heads of grain swallowed by 7 thin, scorched stalks. No one could explain it. And finally, the cupbearer remembered. There is a man in prison. Joseph was brought out, quickly, cleaned, and presented to Pharaoh. With calm wisdom, he explained the dreams. 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. But he didn't stop there. He offered a plan. Save during the years of abundance. Store grain. Prepare. Pharaoh, struck by Joseph's clarity, placed him second in command over all Egypt. The boy who had once been thrown into a pit now stood at the right hand of a king. And as the famine came, people from all nations traveled to Egypt for food. Among them, a group of brother-stired, hungry, unaware that the one who held their future in his hands was the very brother they had betrayed. Joseph recognized them immediately, but he didn't reveal himself. Not at first. He tested them, not out of cruelty, but to see if they had changed. He watched how they treated their youngest brother, Benjamin. He listened to their words, felt their sorrow, their guilt, their love, and when the moment came, he could no longer hold back. He wept. He called out, "I am Joseph." The room froze. They were terrified, but he said, "Do not be afraid. What you meant for evil, God meant for good, to save many lives." He embraced them, forgave them, fed them. He brought his father to Egypt, and when Jacob saw Joseph alive, he wept with joy. The son he had mourned for years was not only alive, but thriving. In the end, the dreams were true, not just the ones of power and position, but the deeper dreams, the dreams of reconciliation, of redemption, of something broken being made whole again. Joseph's story is more than a tale of rising through adversity. It's a story of providence, of how every valley, every injustice, every long night and quiet prayer led to something greater. He was never alone, not in the pit, not in the prison, not in the palace. God was always working, weaving something beautiful from threads that, at first, looked hopeless. It's a reminder that even when dreams seem forgotten, even when we're misunderstood, betrayed, or buried by time, the story isn't over. There is meaning in the waiting, purpose in the silence. And sometimes, the very things that break us are the things that lead us home. Moses wasn't looking for a miracle when it found him. He wasn't praying for a sign or asking for glory. He was tending sheep, far from the palaces of Egypt, far from the noise and ambition of the world he had once known. Years earlier, he had fled that life of privilege, power, and confusion. Though raised as a prince in Pharaoh's house, he had always known he was different, a Hebrew by birth. And when he saw one of his people being beaten by an Egyptian guard, something inside him snapped. He defended the man, struck the Egyptian, and took his life. The next day, when his own people rejected him, he ran into the wilderness, into obscurity. Time passed, decades. His name faded from memory. He married, he became a shepherd, and perhaps he thought this was it, this quiet, lonely life, walking through dry places, caring for animals, raising his family in peace and silence. But God had not forgotten Moses, and God had not forgotten his people. It began on an ordinary day. Moses was near Horeb, the mountain of God. The sun beat down, the sheep grazed lazily, and then he saw Eater bush, burning with fire, yet not consumed. The flames licked the branches, but the leaves didn't curl, the trunk didn't crack. It burned, but it did not burn out. He turned aside, curious, and then a voice spoke from the flame. Moses. Moses. The call wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. Holy ground trembled beneath his feet. God told him to take off his sandals, to come closer, but with reverence. Then, in that sacred moment, God revealed the reason for the fire, the reason for the call. I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries. I know their suffering, and I have come down to rescue them. Imagine the weight of those words. After 400 years of slavery, after generations had cried out, it must have seemed like God had gone silent, but he hadn't. He had been listening all along. And now, he was choosing Moses, this forgotten shepherd, this quiet wanderer, to be the one who would lead his people out. But Moses hesitated. Who am I to go to Pharaoh? He asked. What if they don't believe me? What if I don't speak well? Every insecurity rose to the surface. But God answered each doubt with gentle power. I will be with you. I will give you the words. I will give you signs. I will send your brother, Aaron, to stand beside you. Still, Moses hesitated, but God would not let go. So Moses returned to Egypt, not with a sword, not with an army, but with a staff and with the backing of heaven. He stood before Pharaoh and delivered the message that would shake the empire. Let my people go. Pharaoh laughed, hardened his heart, refused. So the signs began. One by one, plagues fell upon the land. Water turned to blood. Frogs invaded every home. Gnats, then flies. Disease on the livestock. Boils on the skin. Hail from the sky. Locusts devouring every green thing. Darkness so thick, it seemed to smother the breath. With each plague, Pharaoh wavered, then resisted again, until the final sign, the most sorrowful of all. The firstborn of every household in Egypt would die, unless the blood of a lamb marked the doorposts. That night, the angel passed through. Wails filled the city. Grief broke Pharaoh's resistance. At last, he released them, and the Israelites, once slaves, walked out of Egypt as a free people. They left in haste, with bread that had no time to rise, with hearts full of hope and fear and awe. But the story wasn't over. Pharaoh changed his mind and sent his army to bring them back. The people reached the edge of the Red Sea, trapped between water and war. Panic set in. But Moses, calm in the face of chaos, raised his staff, and the waters split. Walls of liquid stood tall on either side, and dry ground stretched between them. The people walked through, mothers holding children, old men leaning on staffs, children wide-eyed with wonder. When the last foot stepped out, the sea returned, crashing over Pharaoh's chariots. Not one enemy remained. The people were free, and for the first time in centuries, they sang. On the far shore of the sea, Miriam, Moses' sister, took a tambourine in her hand and led the women in song, "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea." Moses' journey didn't end at the water's edge. He would lead the people through the wilderness, through hunger and thirst, through rebellion and miracles. But this burning bush, this call, this deliverance was the turning point, a moment when heaven broke into earth, when a man who thought he was finished discovered he was just beginning, when God reminded his people, "I see you, I hear you, I will come for you." And so the memory of the bush that burned without burning out lingers, a symbol of God's presence unfading, unconsumed, a sign that even in the driest seasons of life, even when we think we've been left behind, the fire still burns, the calling still echoes, and the one who sees our pain is already making a way. The journey out of Egypt had begun with such wonder. After centuries of slavery, the people of Israel were finally free. They walked out of bondage with heads high, hearts trembling, and eyes wide. They left with gold and silver, gifts from the very people who had once held them down. There was singing, laughter, and the dust of thousands of feet moving across the wilderness together. For the first time in generations, they were no longer defined by chains or by Pharaoh's commands. They were simply God's people, chosen and carried, moving forward toward a promise. But freedom, as they would soon learn, is not always easy, and faith, even after miracles, is fragile. They didn't take the shortest route. God led them not through the land of the Philistines, but through the desert by way of the Red Sea. A pillar of cloud went before them by day, and a pillar of fire lit their path by night, a constant reminder that they weren't alone, that they were being led, even if they didn't understand the path. They camped near the sea, its vast waters stretching before them, calm and deep. Behind them, the desert, and beyond the desert Pharaoh, because Pharaoh had changed his mind. Again, his heart, hard and unrelenting, burned with fury and fear. He realized what he had done. He had let go of his entire labor force, the backbone of his empire. So he gathered his army. Hundreds of chariots, thousands of soldiers, horses snorting, wheels turning, dust rising, and they chased. The people saw the clouds in the distance, then the glint of metal. The sound of hooves thundered through the desert. Panic spread like wildfire. The taste of freedom quickly turned bitter. Fear overtook faith. They cried out to Moses, accusing him. "Were there not enough graves in Egypt that you brought us here to die?" Their joy vanished in the face of danger. But Moses stood firm, steady in the storm of their voices. He looked out over the sea and said words that would echo through history. "Do not be afraid. Stand firm. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Then God spoke. He told Moses to raise his staff, to stretch out his hand over the water. And when he did, the wind began to blow, not a breeze, but a mighty eastern wind that roared through the night. The sea responded. The waters began to part, not with a sudden splash, but with a rising, groaning power. Walls of water rose up, one on the left, one on the right, and in between Thema path. Dry ground, smooth beneath their feet, solid as any road. And so the people walked, not in panic, but in wonder. Each step was a miracle. Mothers held their children close. Fathers looked up at the towering waters. Children ran, laughing in awe. They crossed beneath the stars, held safe by invisible hands. But Pharaoh's army pursued, rushing into the path, chariots rattling, swords drawn. The people reached the other side, and then God told Moses once more, "Stretch out your hand." And as he did, the waters returned, the walls collapsed, the sea surged back into itself, swallowing horses, riders, and chariots alike. Not one of them remained. The same path that had saved became the boundary that protected. And in the silence that followed, There was only the sound of waves lapping gently at the shore. Then came the song. On the other side of the sea, the people lifted their voices not just in relief, but in worship. A song of triumph, a song of deliverance. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. The horse and its rider he has hurled into the sea. Miriam, the sister of Moses, took a tambourine and led the women in dance, in rhythm, in joy. It was a celebration not just of survival, but of presence. God had not abandoned them. He had seen their fear, and he had answered with power. But deeper than the miracle itself was the message within it, that sometimes God leads us to places that seem impossible, not to trap us, but to show us what only he can do. That the sea isn't an end, it's a doorway. And when we're surrounded, when the enemy is closing in, when there's no path forward and no way back, God is still there, making a way. Creating space where there was none, not with noise or haste, but with wind and time and mercy. As they stood on the other side of the sea, the people didn't just carry gold from Egypt, they carried a new memory, one that would be told to their children and their children's children. That once they walked through a sea with walls of water on either side. That once they saw the impossible made real. That once, when all hope was gone, the water obeyed the voice of God. And the same God who brought them through the sea would guide them through the wilderness ahead. So if you ever find yourself trapped between what was and what's to come, when the way forward feels closed and fear creeps in from behind, remember this: the sea still parts, the wind still blows, and God still fights for his people. Sometimes the greatest path forward begins with a single step onto impossible ground, and in that moment, surrounded by waves, we learn that he is enough, always enough. The desert stretched out endlessly, dry and unchanging. Dust clung to every robe and sandal. The sun beat down during the day, and the cold crept in at night. For the Israelites, each morning was a step deeper into the unknown. They had left Egypt behind, but what lay ahead was unclear. The promise of a new land still felt distant, more like a story than a certainty. With every passing day, fear and frustration grew louder than faith. Their stomachs ached with hunger. The food they had brought from Egypt was long gone, and now they looked around and saw nothing. No fruit trees, no barley fields, just sand, just rocks, just emptiness. They turned to Moses with anger and despair. "Why did you bring us out here to die? At least in Egypt, we had food, we had bread, we had meat." And once again, God heard their cries. He had not led them out to forget them. He had not brought them this far to let them waste away under the burning sun. That night, while the people slept, a promise began to take shape in the silence above them. In the morning, when they woke and stepped outside their tents, the ground was covered in something strange. It wasn't dust, it wasn't sand, it looked like frost, delicate and white, scattered across the earth, like a blanket laid down by unseen hands. They looked closer, small flakes, thin, crisp, like seeds. They were confused. "What is it?" they asked. And Moses said, "It is the bread the Lord has given you to eat." They called it manna, which in Hebrew means simply, "What is it?" It was unlike anything they had known before. It tasted sweet, like wafers made with honey. It was light on the tongue and filled the belly, and it came not from plants or ovens, but from heaven. Every morning they gathered it, just enough for each person. Those who gathered little had no lack. Those who gathered much had no surplus. God provided exactly what they needed, no more, no less. They were told not to hoard it, not to store it overnight. And when they tried, the manna spoiled. It grew worms. It stank. Only on the 6th day were they allowed to gather double, enough to rest on the 7th, the Sabbath, a day set apart. And on that day, the manna stayed fresh. It did not rot. It waited. Day after day, year after year, the manna fell. Every morning, new mercy. Every dawn, new provision. For 40 years, it sustained them. 40 years of footsteps and wandering, of waiting and wondering. And through it all, this strange, sweet bread reminded them, "You are not alone. I see you, I feed you, I walk with you. But the manna was more than just food. It was a test, a daily invitation to trust. Would they believe that God would care for them, not just once, but always, not just in miracles, but in routine? Could they depend on Him in the quiet, when nothing grand or dramatic happened, just the steady, faithful appearance of sustenance? The manna shaped them. It slowed them down. It taught them to listen, to look, to receive. Still, they grumbled. At times, they longed for the food of Egypt, the fish, the cucumbers, the leeks, the onions, the garlic. They remembered the taste of slavery more fondly than the simplicity of freedom. But even when their hearts wandered, God's provision remained. The manna never missed a morning. His care never skipped a day. And in later years, long after they had entered the promised land and the manna ceased, they would look back on those desert days, not with resentment, but with reverence. Because in that dry, lifeless place, God had fed them with bread from heaven. Not just to fill their stomachs, but to teach them that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. The manna was a whisper of something greater to come, a hint, a shadow. Generations later, another voice would speak of bread. A man standing on a hillside, surrounded by thousands, would take 5 loaves and 2 fish, bless them, and feed the multitudes. And the people would remember the manna. They would ask for signs, and Jesus would say, "I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate manna in the wilderness and died, but whoever eats this bread will live forever." The manna was never just about physical hunger. It was about faith, about trust, about learning, slowly and gently, that God can be counted on, not just in the dramatic rescues, but in the quiet mornings. Not just in splitting seas, but in laying down dew. So tonight, as you rest and breathe, remember this: God sees you, and sometimes the way He cares for you may not come in lightning or thunder. Sometimes it comes like manna, soft, enough, and new every morning, a reminder that even in your wilderness, you are never forgotten. Elijah had seen fire fall from the sky. He had stood on Mount Carmel, bold and unwavering, as he challenged the prophets of Baal. He had watched as God sent a blaze from heaven that consumed the offering, the altar, the stones, even the water in the trench around it. The people fell on their faces and cried out, "The Lord, He is God." It was a moment of triumph, a scene that burned with glory and awe. But glory doesn't always quiet the soul, and awe doesn't always protect from fear. Not long after that mountaintop miracle, Elijah found himself running for his life. Queen Jezebel, furious that her prophets had been defeated, sent word that she would have him killed by the next day. So, Elijah fled, not because he didn't believe in God anymore, but because he was exhausted, burned out, tired of the fight. He ran into the wilderness, far from the crowds, far from the noise, far from everything. He left his servant behind and traveled another day's journey into the desert. When he could go no further, he sat under a broom tree and prayed the most human of prayers. "It is enough. I've had enough. Let me die." He had seen miracles, but right now, he didn't want strength. He wanted rest, and instead of rebuke, God gave him exactly what he needed. Elijah fell asleep under that tree, and when he woke, an angel was there. Not with thunder, not with blinding light, but with food, a warm cake baked on hot stones, a jar of water, no sermon, just a meal. Elijah ate and slept again. And once more, the angel returned, gentle and quiet. "Get up and eat," the angel said, "for the journey is too much for you." Not a command, not a push, just care. God knew. He saw the weight in Elijah's heart and offered no shamanly sustenance. Strengthened by that meal, Elijah walked for 40 days and nights, all the way to Mount Horeb, the same mountain where Moses had once seen the burning bush. There, he found a cave and settled in, still worn down by the world. And God spoke, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" The prophet poured out his heart. "I have been very zealous for you, Lord. But the people have rejected your covenant. They've torn down your altars. They've killed your prophets. I'm the only one left, and now they want to kill me too." It wasn't just fear, it was loneliness. He felt abandoned, invisible, unheard. He had given everything, and it still wasn't enough. Then God told him to go out and stand on the mountain. Elijah did. He waited. First came a mighty wind strong enough to shatter rocks, but God was not in the wind. Then came an earthquake trembling, cracking the earth beneath his feet, but God was not in the earthquake. Then came fire roaring, bright, intense, but still, God was not there. And then, a still small voice, a gentle whisper, thin, barely audible, like the breeze that brushes across the face at twilight. And in that whisper, Elijah heard God. It wasn't the thunder or the storm that carried the divine. It was the silence, the quiet, the calm. And maybe that was the lesson Elijah needed most, that God wasn't just in the fire that falls from heaven. He wasn't just in the dramatic answers and the public victories. He was also in the stillness, in the cave, in the fatigue, in the whispered truth that says, "You're not alone." Because right then, in that low place, God told Elijah something that changed everything. There are still 7,000 in Israel who have not bowed to Baal or kissed him. You are not alone, and your work is not in vain. And with that, God gave Elijah new direction, a new mission. He was to anoint new kings. He was to call and mentor a young prophet Elisha, who would walk beside him and one day take up his mantle. It wasn't over. The journey would continue. But this time, Elijah wouldn't walk it alone. The story of Elijah on the mountain is one of the Bible's quietest and most tender moments. It reminds us that even prophets grow weary. Even those with the strongest faith sometimes break. But God never turns away from that weakness. He meets us in it, not with lectures or demands, but with whispers and presence, with rest, with bread and water, with silence that heals, and with the assurance that we are seen, known, and still held in His hands. So, if you've ever felt like the journey is too much, if your spirit is tired, and your prayers are quiet cries for rest, remember Elijah, remember the cave, remember the whisper, because sometimes God speaks the loudest when everything else has gone still, and in that gentle voice is all the strength you need for the next step, not all the answers, not every fix, just enough. And that is always enough. David was never supposed to be the one, at least not in the eyes of the world. He wasn't the tallest, the strongest, or the most experienced. He was the youngest of 8 brothers, the one left behind to tend sheep, while the others stood before the prophet Samuel. When Samuel came to Jesse's house, looking for the next king of Israel, he saw the eldest son and thought, surely this must be the one. He was tall, impressive, commanding. But God whispered something different. Man looks at the outward appearance, but I look at the heart. And so each of Jesse's sons passed before the prophet 7, in total, but none were chosen. Finally, Samuel asked, "Are these all your sons?" And Jesse answered, "There is still the youngest, but he's out in the field, tending the sheep," as if to say, he's just a boy, surely not him. But Samuel waited, and when David was brought in ruddy, bright-eyed, and full of youth, God said, "This is the one, anoint him." So the oil was poured, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. Even then, nothing changed overnight. He didn't ascend to the throne or move into a palace. He returned to the hills, to the quiet, to the sheep, but something had shifted deep inside. The same boy who strummed his harp in solitude was now called by God. It was in the fields that David learned to listen. It was in the stillness of the hills, with only sheep for company and stars for light, that he composed songs to the Lord, songs of praise, of longing, of wonder. He learned to fight there too, not against armies, but against lions and bears that threatened the flock. He fought with slings, with courage, with a heart trained to protect. And it was that same heart that brought him to a battlefield one day, not as a soldier, but as a servant, sent by his father to bring food to his brothers. He arrived to find the army of Israel paralyzed by fear. Every morning and evening, for 40 days, a giant named Goliath came out to taunt them. He was a warrior from birth, covered in armor, towering over every man. His voice shook the valley. His threats rang out like thunder, and no one dared to face him. But David watched and listened, and something stirred within him, not fear, but indignation. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? He asked. The others laughed. His brothers scolded him. Go back to your sheep, they said. But David wouldn't be silenced. He knew this battle wasn't about strength, it was about trust. So they brought him to King Saul. He stood there, small and young, and said, I will fight him. Saul hesitated, but David told him of the lions and the bears, of how God had delivered him then, and would again. Saul offered his armor, but it didn't fit. It weighed him down. So David took it off and went out with only his sling, 5 smooth stones, and a heart anchored in faith. He stood before the giant, and Goliath laughed. Am I a dog, that you come at me with sticks? But David didn't flinch. He didn't shrink back. He said, You come against me with sword and spear, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty. Today the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. Then he ran toward the giant, not away toward. He reached into his pouch, pulled out a stone, and slung it. 1 shot, 1 strike. The stone sank into the giant's forehead, and he fell face down. Silence fell across the valley. Then shouts, then victory. But the story didn't end with the fall of a giant. David became a warrior, a commander, a leader. He served under Saul and was loved by the people. But jealousy grew in Saul's heart, and soon David was on the run, hunted, hiding in caves, crying out in psalms, pursued by the very king he had once honored. It was in these years dark, uncertain, dangerous that David's heart was shaped even more. Not just the heart of a shepherd, but the heart of a king who knew what it meant to be broken, dependent, desperate for God. Over time, Saul's reign crumbled, and David ascended not through ambition, but through patience. He became king. He united the tribes. He brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. He danced before the Lord, wild and unashamed, in celebration. But David was not without flaw. He was human. He made grave mistakes. The most painful of them, his sin with Bathsheba and the arranged death of her husband. Uriah revealed the cracks in even the greatest man. And yet, when confronted, David didn't hide. He didn't shift blame. He wept. He repented. Create in me a clean heart, O God, he wrote, and renew a right spirit within me. That's why David was called a man after God's own heart, not because he was perfect, but because he always returned. He always came back to the presence of God. David's life was a tapestry of worship and war, of beauty and brokenness, of courage and confession, and through it all, God remained. Through the pastures and the palace, through the songs and the sins, David walked with the Lord, and when he passed, full of years, he left behind not only a kingdom, but a legacy. From his line would come another king, one who would also be born in Bethlehem, one who would also be misunderstood, rejected, and yet chosen. Jesus, the Son of David, would one day sit on a throne that would never end. So when you think of David, remember the boy with the harp, the youth with the sling, the man with the crown, the sinner with the broken heart, the worshipper with the voice that still sings through the Psalms, and know that God doesn't choose the obvious. He chooses the willing, the ones who listen in the quiet, the ones who return when they fall, the ones who, like David, are brave enough to trust that giants can fall and tender enough to be changed when they're wrong, because in every season high or low, God remains faithful to the hearts that are his. Daniel had always been a man of quiet conviction. From the earliest days of his life, when he was taken from his home in Jerusalem and brought to Babylon as a captive, he lived with one purpose: to remain faithful, no matter where he found himself. He was young when it happened, just a teenager, pulled from the comfort of his culture, his language, his temple, and thrown into the dazzling, unfamiliar world of the Babylonian Empire, a place where idols were worshipped, where food was offered to strange gods, where power was measured by wealth and pride. But Daniel didn't waver. Even in the court of a foreign king, Surrounded by voices that tried to reshape his identity, he held on to his God. He began his life in Babylon. With a small decision, he chose not to eat the royal food or drink the royal wine, choosing instead a simple diet, one that kept his heart aligned with the law of his people. It may have seemed like a small thing, but it was a quiet act of rebellion, a whisper of faith in a land of noise, and God honored it. Daniel found favor. He grew in wisdom and strength, and soon he was placed in positions of influence, serving kings with excellence, interpreting dreams with divine insight, solving riddles no one else could understand. His reputation grew, but so did the jealousy around him. Years passed, kings came and went, and through it all, Daniel remained a servant of heaven in the halls of earthly power. By the time Darius the Mede took the throne, Daniel was old, a man with silver in his hair and strength in his soul. The new king saw in him something rare, something true. He planned to set Daniel over the entire kingdom, and that plan stirred envy in the hearts of the other officials. They searched for a flaw, a crack in his character, but found nothing. Daniel was trustworthy, honest, devoted, so they turned to the one thing they knew: he would never compromise his prayer life. 3 times a day, Daniel would kneel in his upper room, windows open toward Jerusalem, and pray. He had done it since his youth. Morning, noon, and evening his voice rose like incense, steady and faithful, even when no one was listening. The conspirators approached the king with a plan disguised as loyalty. They convinced him to sign a decree stating that for 30 days, no one could pray to any god or human except the king himself. Anyone who disobeyed would be thrown into the lion's den. Darius, flattered and unaware of their trap, signed the decree into law. It could not be undone. When Daniel heard about the law, he didn't panic, he didn't hide, he didn't hesitate. He went home, opened his windows, and prayed, just as he always had. Not louder, not bolder, just the same. A rhythm of trust in a world of threats. The officials were waiting. They burst in and caught him in the act. They brought him before the king, and Darius, heartbroken, realized what had been done. He tried to find a way to save Daniel. He searched all day for a loophole, a legal exception, but there was none. The law stood, and so, with deep sorrow, Darius gave the order. That evening, Daniel was led to the den. The stone was rolled away. The lions were restless, pacing, their growls low and deep. Darius looked at Daniel with grief in his eyes and said, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." Then the stone was sealed, and silence fell. The king returned to his palace, but he found no rest. He refused food. He ignored music. Sleep fled from him. He paced through the night, haunted by the image of his friend in that dark den. And as soon as the sky began to lighten, as soon as morning crept over the city walls, Darius ran to the den. He called out, his voice trembling, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" And then an answer. From deep within the stone chamber, a voice rose, calm, unshaken. "O King, live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not harmed me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I done any wrong before you." Darius cried out with joy. He ordered the stone to be rolled away. Daniel emerged, untouched. Not a scratch on him, not even a mark from a claw or a tooth. He had spent the night in the presence of danger, but had not been alone. The king issued a new decree, one that echoed through every nation and tongue. "In every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed, and his dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." Daniel's story isn't just about courage, it's about consistency. It's about choosing the same quiet faith every day, even when the stakes rise. It's about praying not because it's safe, but because it's who you are. And in the end, It's about the God who sees, who guards, who sends angels to stand between us and the jaws of fear. Even in the darkest dens, in the silence of night, when no one else sees, he sees, and he acts, not always with fire or thunder, but sometimes with a whisper that closes mouths and calms hearts. So when the world feels like a den of lions, when faith feels risky and the night feels long, remember Daniel, remember the quiet that held firm, and remember the God who never left his side. It happened in a quiet town, unnoticed by most of the world. There were no crowds waiting, no parades, no royal banners. Just a small stable on the edge of Bethlehem, where animals slept and hay was scattered across the floor. The streets outside were packed with people who had come for the census, but no one paid attention to the young woman walking wearily beside her husband. She was tired, exhausted, really. She had traveled far, her body heavy with the weight of new life, her steps slow and deliberate. Her name was Mary, chosen, favored, and yet so ordinary in the eyes of others. She had carried this promise quietly, tucked beneath her ribs, whispered into her heart by the angel months before, and now the time had come. There was no room at the inn, no soft bed, no warm room to welcome the arrival of the one who would change everything. But the promise didn't need a palace. Heaven doesn't measure beauty the way earth does. So the child was born in the humblest place, not wrapped in royal silk, but in strips of cloth, not placed in a golden cradle, but in a feeding trough. And yet, in that still and sacred moment, the King of Kings entered the world, not with thunder, not with glory, but with the cry of a newborn and the breath of God in fragile lungs. The Word became flesh. Emmanuel, God with us. While the world slept, heaven sang. In the fields nearby, shepherds were keeping watch. They were outcasts by society's standards, rough hands, sleepless eyes, men who lived among sheep and silence. But they were the first to hear. A light broke through the night sky, and an angel appeared, not one, but many. A heavenly host singing, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men." The shepherds, trembling with awe, hurried to see what had been told to them. And when they arrived, they saw exactly what the angel had described: a baby wrapped in cloth, lying in a manger, surrounded by straw and the scent of animals, watched over by two tired parents who had been swept up in a mystery greater than themselves. They looked at the child, and something stirred within them, not fear, not confusion, but wonder, because here, in the simplest setting, was the fulfillment of centuries of prophecy. The child of promise, the one foretold by Isaiah and longed for by generations. And as the shepherds left to tell others, Mary stayed. She held the child close and treasured every word, every moment, turning them over in her heart like polished stones. Far away in the east, others had seen signs too. Wise men astrologers, scholars had watched the stars and noticed something new, a star brighter than the rest, moving, guiding. They followed it for months, bringing with them treasures, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, gifts fit for a king, though they had no idea they would be laid at the feet of a child born in a stable. When they finally found him, they fell on their knees. These men of wealth and knowledge bowed low before a baby, because something deep within them recognized what words could not explain. This child was different. This child was the fulfillment of all searching. His birth was not random. It was the moment everything turned. The night split in two before him and after him, and though the world did not yet know his name, all of heaven rejoiced. The angels had waited. The prophets had spoken. And now, at last, the Messiah had come. But the story didn't stop at the manger. This baby would grow. He would laugh, learn to walk, play in the dust of Nazareth, help his father in the carpenter's shop. He would sit in the temple at 12, asking questions that astonished scholars. He would grow in wisdom and stature and favor with both God and men. And one day, he would step out into the world with nothing but his voice and his presence, and he would change hearts wherever he went. Still, it all began herein, the quiet, in the dark, under the stars. The light of the world chose to begin his life, not in grandeur, but in humility. And in doing so, he sanctified the low places, the unnoticed corners, the uncelebrated beginnings. He came not just for the powerful, but for the forgotten, not for the righteous, but for the weary, not to sit on a throne far above, but to walk among us, beside us, as one of us. And so, as you drift off tonight, think of that stable, think of the hush, the stillness, the peace that wrapped around that sacred night. A baby breathing in the chill air, stars peeking through the cracks in the roof, Mary's tired smile as she rocked the hope of the world in her arms. That's how it all began. Not with noise, not with might, but with a whisper of love wrapped in swaddling cloth. A love that would never leave, never fail, and never forget. A love that came quietly, but would one day speak life into every heart it touched. The day had been long, full of crowds and questions, full of stories and healings and the endless hum of need. Jesus had been teaching by the sea, his words carried over the water, speaking of seeds and soil, of light and hidden treasure, of the kingdom of God breaking in like a whisper and a wildfire at the same time. The people pressed in, hungry not just for bread but for something deeper, for truth, for healing, for hope. And when evening came, with the sky turning shades of fire and indigo, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." They climbed into the boat, leaving the crowds behind, and set out across the Sea of Galilee. The wind was soft at first, the water calm. The boat rocked gently as they moved further from the shore. The disciples, some of them seasoned fishermen, settled into the rhythm of rowing, their muscles relaxed, their eyes growing heavy under the twilight sky. And Jesus, weary from the day, lay down on a cushion in the stern of the boat and fell asleep. Deep, undisturbed sleep, so deep that not even the first gusts of wind stirred him. But then, suddenly, the sky shifted. The sea, which had been like glass, began to ripple, then churn, then rise. A storm rolled in without warning, the kind of storm that Galilean fishermen knew too well: violent, fast, wild. The wind roared like a beast, and waves climbed higher and higher, crashing against the boat, spilling over the sides, filling it with water. The sails strained, the wood creaked, panic set in. The disciples bailed water with their hands, shouted to each other, struggled to stay upright, and still, Jesus slept. The fear turned quickly into desperation. They shook him awake, voices breaking with urgency, with terror. "Teacher, don't. You care if we drown." Not just a cry for help, but an accusation buried in fear. "Don't. You care? How could you sleep through this? How could you be so calm while we're sinking?" Jesus opened his eyes. He stood, slowly, deliberately, not with haste or alarm, but with the peace of someone who knew exactly what was happening. He looked at the waves, the chaos, the wind that screamed through the rigging, and he spoke. Just 3 words: "Peace, be still." And instantly, the wind ceased. The waves flattened. The sea was still again, like it had been when they first set out. The storm obeyed. Nature itself bent to his voice. The disciples stood in stunned silence. The only sound now was their own breathing, ragged and shallow in the sudden quiet. And Jesus turned to them not harshly, but with deep knowing. "Why are you so afraid?" He asked. "Do you still have no faith?" Not a scolding, but a question meant to reach deeper, past the moment, into their hearts. He had been with them. The same Jesus who healed the blind and fed the hungry had been right there in the boat. And yet, in the face of the storm, they had forgotten. They looked at him with new eyes. "Who is this?" they whispered to one another, "that even the wind and the waves obey him? Not just a teacher, not just a prophet, something more, someone holy. Someone whose voice carried the same authority that had once spoken stars into the sky and split the sea in two. Someone who didn't just calm storms, but who carried peace within himself." That night, something changed in them. They had seen power before. They had seen miracles. But this was different. This wasn't just healing. It was command, control over creation itself. And yet, it came with gentleness, with quiet, no shouting, no battle, just peace spoken into chaos. For the rest of their lives, they would remember it. The storm that stopped, not because the wind died down on its own, but because Jesus told it to. The fear that turned into awe. The moment they realized that being in the boat with Jesus didn't mean there would be no storms, it meant the storms didn't get the final say. And so it is with us. Storms will come, sometimes suddenly, without warning. The winds of anxiety, the waves of grief, the deep water of uncertainty rising up around us. But Jesus is in the boat. Even when it feels like he's asleep, even when the storm rages louder than our prayers, he is there, calm, steady, and when the time is right, he speaks. Not always with immediate rescue, but always with presence, always with peace that doesn't make sense, peace that settles deep into the soul. Sometimes, he calms the storm. Other times, he calms the child in the middle of it. Either way, his word remains, peace, be still. Let that echo as you rest tonight. Let it move through your thoughts like wind through leaves. Let it still the waves of worry and the winds of what if, because he is near. And when he is near, even the sea obeys. It was early, the kind of early where the sky still clings to the last shades of night, where the air is hushed and the earth feels like it's holding its breath. A group of women made their way to a garden, carrying spices, hearts heavy with grief. They walked slowly, silently, still reeling from the shock of what had happened just days before. Jesus, the one who had healed the sick, opened the eyes of the blind, raised the dead, calmed the storms with his voice, had been crucified, betrayed by one of his own, handed over to Roman soldiers, sentenced by a fearful governor, mocked by a crowd, and hung on a cross. The sky had darkened that day, at noon. The earth had trembled. And now, he was gone. They had watched as his body was taken down, wrapped in linen, and laid in a borrowed tomb, sealed behind a heavy stone. Hope, it seemed, had died with him. And yet, even in their sorrow, they came. It was all they could do, honor him with the spices, tend to his broken body. They hadn't come expecting a miracle. They had come to mourn. But when they reached the tomb, they stopped. The stone, the massive stone, had been rolled away. The entrance stood open. Alarm surged through them. They stepped inside, hearts racing, breath caught in their throats. But his body was gone. Instead, two figures in white stood before them, their presence bright and strange and unmistakably otherworldly. The women fell to the ground, terrified, but the figures spoke gently. "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen, just as he said." The words didn't make sense at first. Risen? How could it be? But the memory returned. Jesus had spoken of this moment. He had told them, again and again, that he would rise on the third day. And now, the impossible had become real. The women ran from the tomb, their grief transformed into wonder. They told the others, voices trembling with urgency and disbelief. Some thought it nonsense. Others ran to see for themselves. Peter reached the tomb, saw the linen cloths lying there, and left in awe, unable to make sense of it all. But later that day, everything would become clear. Two disciples were walking to a village called Emmaus, talking about everything that had happened. They were joined by a stranger, gentle, kind, curious. "What are you discussing?" he asked. They told him about Jesus of Nazareth, the one they had hoped would redeem Israel, the one who had been crucified. And then, this morning, the strange report from the women, the empty tomb, the angels. But still, their eyes were downcast, their hope buried with him. And the stranger began to speak. He opened the scriptures to them, walking through the words of Moses and the prophets, showing how everything pointed to the Messiah, how suffering was not defeat, but the path to glory. Their hearts burned within them as he spoke. They reached the village and invited him to stay. And when he broke the bread at the table, their eyes were opened. They saw it was Jesus, alive, present, and then he vanished from their sight. They ran back to Jerusalem, the road now lit with joy instead of sorrow, their steps quick with wonder. "He is risen," they told the others. "We have seen him with our own eyes." And soon, Jesus appeared again, to all the disciples. In a locked room, he stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." He showed them his hands and his side. He wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a dream. He was real, alive, risen, just as he had promised. For 40 days, he remained with them, teaching, encouraging, restoring. He found Peter, who had denied him 3 times, and offered not shame, but love. "Do you love me?" Jesus asked, again and again, not to condemn, but to rebuild what had been broken. He walked with them, ate with them, reminded them of everything he had taught. And then, one day, he led them out to the Mount of Olives. There, he blessed them, and as they watched, he was taken up into heaven, hidden from their sight by a cloud. But he did not leave them empty. He promised his Spirit. He promised power. He promised that what had begun with him would continue through them. And as they stood gazing upward, 2 men in white appeared beside them and said, "Why do you stand looking into the sky? This same Jesus, who has been taken from you into heaven, will return in the same way you have seen him go." And so the story of resurrection became the foundation of everything that followed. The cross was not the end. The tomb was not the final word. Death had been defeated, not just delayed. Jesus had overcome the grave, not for himself alone, but for all who would follow him. The stone had been rolled away not so he could get out, but so we could see in. So we could know, without doubt, that hope is never buried for good. Resurrection is not just a single moment in history. It's the heartbeat of our faith. It's the whisper that speaks through every dark night, every broken dream, every quiet grave. It says, life is not over, light is not done, love does not fail. It speaks into every place where we thought the story had ended and says, watch, there is more. So tonight, if anything in you feels lost, buried, beyond repair, remember this: the tomb is empty, the stone is rolled away. The same Jesus who wept, who bled, who died, he lives. And he still comes to the broken-hearted, to the doubters, to the ones walking away in sorrow. He meets them on the road. He speaks peace over their fear. He breaks bread and opens eyes. And he whispers, again and again, I am here. I have overcome. You are not alone. There are moments in every story when it feels like the journey has ended, when every hope has been realized, or every sorrow has finally faded into the past. Yet for those who trust in God, the end is never truly the end. The Bible draws to a close not with a goodbye, but with a promise, a vision so beautiful, so complete, that it calls to something deep within every heart. John, exiled on the lonely island of Patmos, was given a glimpse of what is yet to come. He saw with the eyes of his spirit a future where heaven and earth would no longer be divided, where the distance between God and humanity would finally be closed forever. In that vision, John saw a new heaven and a new earth, shimmering and unspoiled. The old world, with its heartbreak and loss, its pain and regret, had passed away. The seethe symbol of separation and fear was no more, and out of heaven, like a bride dressed in beauty, came the New Jerusalem, radiant, pure. A city built not on power or pride, but on the love and faithfulness of God. Its gates were always open. Its streets glowed with light. The foundations were set with every precious stone, each one a reminder that what God builds, he builds to last forever. And then, in a voice as clear as running water, John heard the greatest promise. Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them, and be their God. No more distance, no more barriers, just presence close, warm, unbroken. Every tear wiped away, not by the passing of time, but by the very hand of God. There would be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain. All the old things, the shadows and sorrows of every sleepless night would be gone. In their place, peace, laughter, reunion, every wound healed, every longing satisfied, every question answered, not with words, but with love. Imagine that city. Imagine sunlight that never burns out, because God himself is the light. Imagine a river, bright as crystal, flowing through the center, with trees on both side streets that bear fruit in every season, their leaves bringing healing to the nations. The curse that began so long ago in a garden is finally ended in another garden, one that never fades, never withers, never closes its gates. People from every nation and language gather, singing a song that never grows old. Joy is as natural as breath. Rest is as deep as the sea is wide. And at the center of it all is Jesus the Lamb, who became a shepherd, the King who wore a crown of thorns and now wears a crown of glory. His face is the first thing every heart longs to see. His presence is what makes heaven, heaven. There are no more tears, because he has carried them all. No more fear, because he is safety itself. No more loneliness, because in his company every soul finds home. He speaks your name, and you know, at last, you are completely known, completely loved, completely at peace. John's vision was not just a distant hope for another world. It is a promise for this one, woven into every longing and every moment of beauty and rest. It is the reason we keep walking, keep trusting, even when the path is dark or uncertain. It is the reason we can lay down to sleep and know that the story God writes is always heading somewhere good, even if tonight feels unfinished or heavy. For every sorrow, there is comfort. For every struggle, there is strength. For every goodbye, there is a coming day when reunion will be forever. And so the story ends, not with an ending, but with an invitation. Come, come to the water, come to the table, come home. The Spirit and the bride say, come. Whoever is thirsty, let them come and drink freely from the water of life. The gates are open, the light is on, the table is set, all is ready. The same hands that shape the stars now hold you. The same voice that called light out of darkness calls you by name, calling you into rest that never ends. As the night deepens and you settle into sleep, let this promise settle over you like a warm blanket. There is a place where everything is made new, where every fear is calmed, where every restless heart finds peace. That is the future. That is the hope. Not just for someday, but for every day you wait, every day you wonder, every day you trust. The best is yet to come. And even now, in the quiet, you are held by the one who makes all things new.